Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. This bill is a draconian, it's antidemocratic, and it really is a reflection of the form of this government. How it is that you cannot have a good look at what you're doing here to Australian families right across this country. How is it that you cannot equate the care of an employee on a construction site, that they are able to go home to their family at night instead of being injured or killed on that site? How is it that you cannot care about those workers who are bullied in the workplace because they cannot sit across from their employer and argue for a fair wage, for fair conditions, so that they can go home to their families and have a good night's sleep, so that they can look after their families and pay for the goods and services that their families require like any other Australian family. That is what you are attacking tonight. That is what you are attacking at the heart of this country. That is what you are doing. You hide behind your computers, you hide behind your books, you sit in your glorious offices, you sit there, you discuss supposedly and debate amongst yourselves, but all you're doing is convincing yourselves that this is the way to keep Australians disempowered. This is the way you keep Australians down. This is the way you do not encourage productivity, that you do not encourage the best in an individual or a family or an organisation in this country. This is how you keep the workers down, through fear, through draconian laws that disable the opportunity for leadership in places to assist those to stand up because they cannot stand up for themselves. That is what your attack is tonight. It is at the heart of this country's democracy, it is at the heart of a fair go, and it is at the heart of every single Australian who wants to do good, do well for themselves, their families and their community. Madam Acting Deputy President, when I started in the workforce, I started out as a journalist, and I was a very proud union member of the then Australian Journalists Association. And it was the AJA, which then became the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the MEAA, that fought for the rights of journalists, that fought and still does fight for the rights of journalists, for producers, for editors, and the CPSU that fought for the camera operators, the editors, production teams, to ensure that those people in those industries, in that career, could achieve at the highest level with fair wage and conditions. What you're doing here tonight impacts on every single union member in this country. But that's the whole purpose of it, isn't it? It's about keeping the workers down. That's what you're about. This bill erodes the rights of workers and will erode the rights of those who are most vulnerable. I'm also a member of the First Nations Workers Alliance in this country and enormously proud of the union movement, in particular the Northern Territory unions, who fight fiercely for the many different workers in hundreds of different occupations, the health workers, the nurses, the teachers, the construction workers, the electricians, the boiler makers. I'm enormously proud of our union movement. The First Nations Workers Alliance, Madam Acting Deputy President, is an organisation that has campaigned and fought for the rights of First Nations workers, and especially those caught up in the Community Development Program. Ah yes, the CDP. It's interesting, not a word has been said about that, and yet there are 33,000 Australians in this country who are forced to work for $11 an hour. Shame on you. $11 an hour. And you wonder why we stand up here and fight this bill. The First Nations Workers Alliance was established by the ACTU to provide CDP workers a collective voice to campaign for fair wages and employment conditions. There are more than 30,000 people who are covered by the CDP, and most of those are First Nations people. And they're workers, Madam Acting Deputy President, and they turn up to do a job under the CDP. But in return, they do not get fair wages and they do not get fair conditions. Under the CDP, the government has basically created a pool of free labour for employers to access. But those employers have none of the responsibilities that we should expect in this country. CDP workers don't have any annual leave or sick leave, and they're also specifically excluded from things like federal occupational health and safety and workers' compensation legislation. The First Nations Workers Alliance was formed to be a collective voice for the workers in this scheme. The breaching under the CDP scheme for issues that really are just incredible to think about. The breaches, let me just share a bit with the Senate. The breaches that a lot of the workers on CDP are breached for is because they cannot make the hundreds or thousands of kilometres to particular locations to be included. In these regional and remote areas, there are flooding concerns in terms of the ability to get there. There is certainly the lack of the IT network. There's sorry business. There are legitimate reasons caring for a child. There are legitimate reasons why CDP workers cannot get to specific events or appointments, but they're breached. They're breached. And you know what, Madam Acting Deputy President? They're not just breached for one day. They're not breached for one day. They're breached for 8 weeks. 8 weeks. How would you feel having no income, even if it is $11 an hour, no income for 8 weeks? How do you pay your bills? How do you pay your electricity bills? How do you keep up the rent? What about food and clothing? The basic necessities that are so desperately required. So what it does is it entrenches poverty instead. Unemployed people in remote areas must take part in this troubled community development program to receive welfare payments and can be docked about $50 per day for missing activities. The Work for the Dole participants in one remote community were slapped with infringements, an estimated 15 times on average, Madam Deputy President, worth at least $650 per person or 6% of their annual income. Most participants in the federal government's mainstream Work for the Dole scheme, job active, were not slapped with penalties. So the damage caused by the CDP is immense. The reports from participants about what has happened to them under the scheme are really quite heartbreaking. Jawoyn man Jamie Arfat said being on CDP at Barunga in the Northern Territory, just south-east of Katherine, was like being a slave. After being breached up to 3 times a week and once being cut off payments for 8 weeks, he couldn't pay the rent, he didn't have money to buy food during the 8 weeks he was breached. And this program is supposedly an employment program, but it's actually a program driving people further into poverty. And where would they be without their union? It's the union movement that has brought this issue, this absolutely devastating, discriminatory program, to the fore here in Australia and making sure that all Australians are aware of it. Former Liberal Deputy Leader Fred Chaney said the $1.5 billion initiative had seriously disadvantaged vulnerable people. Mr Chaney said the CDP has caused pain and hunger, imprisoned in a system of immense complexity, which is causing immense hardship through breaching. The First Nations Workers Alliance has fought the unfair and discriminatory CDP for the past 2 years, and don't worry, we will continue to fight it. It's down largely to the hard work of the FNWA that the government was forced to bring in reforms to the CDP. The CDP is still a terrible, terrible scheme that is causing far greater hardship and not leading to the creation of any meaningful employment or economic development. But I know that without the First Nations Workers Alliance, without the ACTU, that it would be far worse. And I'm enormously grateful that we have the union movement there that is backing up the most vulnerable people in this country, and in particular those who are on this terrible discriminatory scheme. Because that's what unions do. The unions do get out there and back up the people and support the people that require it. You know, this government has form in picking on certain examples. And sure, what organisation doesn't have its problems? But just like you did to the Northern Territory by intervening in 2007, intervening completely in 2007 based on 1 or 2 points or facts that you thought they were facts, you've basically just destroyed the livelihood of thousands and thousands of people. That's taken 12 years, even now. And you want to introduce the cashless debit card on top of the basics card because your sole agenda is to completely keep people disempowered and entrenched in poverty. Do not let those Australians who are not as fortunate as you to try to rise up the ladder. It's best to keep them down. And that's the only way that we can view this legislation. It's not about a fair go. It's about keeping UMOB up there and the rest of the country down there. This bill wants to silence the voices of the people represented by unions. It will ensure less safe workplaces. It will ensure more wage and superannuation theft. It will ensure a less effective union movement, more preoccupied about getting its paperwork right than doing the job, which has delivered better wages and conditions for workers in Australia for over a century. This bill will not ensure wage growth for Australian workers. It will do nothing good for the economy, and it will certainly do nothing to stimulate growth, jobs and development in remote Australia. You already have a record that shows you entrench people in poverty, and that's where this bill will keep them.